Hello, buenas noches. Welcome to Elisava. My name is Andres Colmenares. I am the director of the Master in Design for Responsible AI, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this first edition of the Critical Features Talks series. I just want to thank all of you that are here in Barcelona in this room, but also those of you who are watching this live stream from many different places in the world. Very exciting to get this series started. As you know from all the social posts and the Elisava and IAM channels, this Critical Features Talks is a new series of hybrid events, and also in April we will release a podcast that will feature a different different perspectives, mainly coming from the faculty members of the Master in Design for Responsible AI, but also current participants that are joining us today. And the purpose of this series is to have conversations around the intersection of AI, which is in the agendas of everyone and everywhere, in particular a responsible take on AI, and its relation with media, with design, in the current state of a climate emergency. The approach that we are following in this master, it's our intention also to engage different type of people in the studies, in the investigations that we are currently running in the program. And these critical features talks are a first step into an approach of essentially going out of the school, going out of the classroom, and open spaces for reflection on the different ways that as a society we are relating with AI from an ecological, social, technological perspective. And we're very lucky to have today a very special guest coming all the way from California, Xiaowei Wang, who is, as I mentioned, part of the faculty of the master, and is currently leading a course on responsible AI as part of the program. And today they have prepared something, very, I would say, original, right? It's the first time that you're sharing this in public.
In work in progress.
It's a work in progress, exactly. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic to you. Thanks for being here, and I invite you to give a warm applause to Xiaowei Wang.
Thank you. my slides back up. Bear with me. But thank you all for coming tonight and taking the time to be here. I feel like whenever I do this, I should sing a song for people in the audience to provide background music. But truly, thank you all for joining me this evening. My name is Xiaowei Wang. I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Los Angeles' Center on Race and Digital Justice. I'm also a lead steward of Collective Action School, which is a community-driven school for tech workers who are looking to make change either within their workplaces or outside of their workplaces. And I really wanted to thank Andres for framing this as a critical futures talk. And tonight I'm going to present two works that are in progress. I think when we talk about futures, it's often in this sense of the speculative and moving forward, but I think there's just as much importance as in speculating the past. And so if we think about archaeology and history as a speculation of the past, right, that also can bring to light a lot of things in our present. I don't have any design solutions or, completed products to show you tonight. I apologize if that's what you were hoping for, because mostly I also want to unsettle the notions of the future and futurity as predictable, as finished, as done. And really reminding all of us and myself that we're always beginning to understand that the world is always being made and never finished, as Grace Lee Boggs says. So part of this being presented with the future as predictive, apocalyptic, or the story of eventual progress, these kind of binaries between apocalypse and hope, is a project central to what theorist Sylvia Wynter calls a notion of biocentricity. And this notion of biocentricity really refers to the colonial Enlightenment era narratives that time is not only linear, but that scientific and technological progress is inevitable. So you can think about kind of these narratives around technology since the 1960s through the 1970s. You see kind of Apple heralding it as the inevitable marker of progress and the thing that will replace the old. But I think it's important for us to really try to unsettle this kind of key element of biocentricity. The first work in progress that I want to talk about is called An Archive of Witch Fever, and it's really centered around climate, queer computation, queer computing, and also speculating into the past and using artificial neural networks as a way to not look into the future, but really try to think, unearth, and make the past messy. And I really started this project through actually looking into archives and feeling that very embodied sense of, this past is very much this kind of storytelling, this narrative, this using the technology of storytelling to try and piece together what may or may not have been. It's a process that, as I was drawn through it, I was really thinking a lot about Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation. So rather than trying to mark what happened when, but really the possibilities of the past and the lives and stories untold. So what is queer computing? Jacob Gabori writes about queer computing, and this is really referencing the queer art of failure. Queer computing is those forms of computation that fail, break down, recur, and run forever, and models of computing that are outside of or beyond so-called universal Turing computation. That is, those processes which disappear or recede from computational forms of knowing. Using this idea of queer computing, I also want to really take seriously what scholar Tao-Lei Goff writes about climate change, that the climate change we think of as a contemporary phenomenon tied to globalization, but she writes that climate change began in 1492, the moment of arrival of Christopher Columbus to what he called the New World. And through these residues of extracting land, extracting labor, shaping it into this, again, linear notion of progress, that somehow through this extraction and through technological progress, our world will be shaped for the better. That narrative of linearity and projection continues onwards, especially in the ways that we think about climate now. The Critical Carbon Computing Collective, they write that computers are now, they lie at the heart of climate politics. So when we talk about climate crisis, it's about prediction, projecting. It's about modeling these scenarios. What are the limits to growth? What's the carrying capacity, right? But if we really think about this as beginning at a different time scale, at a different point in time, and thinking about this kind of ancient twisted karma coming from this era of land and labor extraction through plantations, what might we surface? And in climate projections that are really predicated still on these kinds of thresholds and projecting the future, we can only come to very limited, finite solutions in a way. They still ultimately revolve around technocratic solutions, right? That still revolve around extracting from mines. What are the material resources that we need to build even further technology? So using an out-of-the-box artificial neural network, I started to play around with creating these speculative botany patterns. And these speculative botany patterns, usually neural networks, right, we try to think of it as like modeling these scenarios into the future. Instead, I'm using archival imagery. So archival imagery from trans-Pacific plantations alongside botanical images from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So if you look at this image, this is kind of like the process of creating the speculative botany and the different iterations that come out of the neural network. So really using archival images like this image here of Asian plantation workers on the sugarcane fields of Hawaii. And it became really enraptured with using this language of botanical prints because they really came to me as this kind of epitome of empire, right? This very intimate geography. So you have the British Empire going out to different colonies and sending economic botanists out on this journey of discovery to bring back plants. And they would kind of experiment on them in Kew Gardens to try and figure out, oh, is this an economically important plant? How do we plant whole fields of this? How can we basically engineer this to be a way that we extract more? And there's a kind of negative capacity for beauty to this. Like they're incredibly beautiful prints that essentially end up in the heart of empire in adorning people's walls, people's dresses, wallpaper, things like that. And they also, these prints really speak to a kind of very, again, linear colonial sense of time. Because if you look at these botanical illustrations, they essentially take a plant from all different seasons and distill it down to one plant. So it's physically impossible that you could have like a plant that is both blossoming while at the same time yielding fruit and also leaves are falling. So it's all the seasons collapsed into one drawing. And instead of this bounded future, I think for me, this act of taking archival imagery was to really create this pluriversal botany that never was. Plants that are incredibly unproductive, not real, not economically useful at all. And so this is, kind of the original imagery that I'm working with. Japanese workers on a sisal plantation in Hawaii, a classic William Morris print of like pomegranates. And out of this, playing around with a neural network to then surface this new botanical print and this very speculative botany. I was working with a botanical illustrator to try and sort of figure out what does a non-useful plant look like. So again, these images, certain rubber plantations from Indonesia, across other parts of the world. And then as I was drawn into the archives more. I really found myself situated into actually the kind of plantation economies of Hawaii. And as it turns out, through these layers of migration in Hawaii, which was part of the long residue of the afterlife of slavery in the continental US. So after slavery was abolished, they started importing workers from Asia onto Hawaii to work on the plantations there. And you would have these large sugarcane plantations that would take up most of the Hawaiian islands. And then I found this archive, literally, of plantation workers' clothing from Barbara Kawakami, who is the seamstress. And I fell in love with her story because she was a seamstress who was gathering songs, the stories of plantation life, and it was all predicated on her interacting with these plantation workers. So she would repair their clothing, she would work with them, to sort of, through this act of mending and repair, she really became this community force and community storyteller. And so her archive is just, all of these old work jackets, fabric that was made and remade. And also, as I would come to find in the archives, actually a lot of botanical prints that the plantation workers would buy from the, like the store on the plantation that they would make into workers' clothing. And so inspired by her act of using clothing to really bind together community, I've been working on taking these prints and actually, refashioning and remaking this based off of her archive of workers' clothing. So work jackets, work pants, things like that. And I was really entranced with the materiality of that archive, the ways that mending was very visible. So I've been experimenting actually with thinking about thread, the kind of metaphor of thread as storytelling, and actually spinning my own thread. So combining conductive thread with fibers like milkweed, mushrooms that I like grind up into a kind of fiber and spin into a thread, and then actually using a magnetization process on the conductive thread, you can start to embed zeros and ones. So you can think about it as a strategy to put people's stories and data into this very physical form. So because it's magnetized, I love that as a material as well, right? Because it's like this weird physical process that also can be read through digital means. One thing that really was remarkable, one of the many things that was remarkable about her archive was when you start to look at it, everything is such a strange size. It's made by workers, right? And so essentially, when I started talking to the archivist who is in charge of this collection, she was like, well, I'm taking a shirt that I already wear and cutting a pattern, cutting new fabric based off of this, or I'm holding fabric up to someone's shoulders and trying to figure out the most efficient way to cut that piece of fabric, right? So that I don't have to buy more than I need to. And through this, it really reminded me of these different forms of measurement and this concept of the body inch in Chinese medicine. And I was really this kind of resonance between body and measurement and this universal measurement. So, you know, whether it's like the centimeter or the imperial inch, it becomes very universalized, right? And these documents around plantation management, it's always like, you should plant your rows of crops like exactly this width apart. And how valuable this unit of measurement as standardized and universal really became. And a lot of this too, like attached to this idea of the average size of people, or, you know, how do we use this universal ruler to figure out what that, you know, median size or average is. But the body inch, which if you've ever done acupuncture, is actually very embedded in Chinese medicine. And so it's not a universal. Everyone has a different body inch. It's literally the measurement of the width of your thumb, and a very skilled acupuncture practitioner can like scan you and eyeball you and figure out like where, you know, your body inch is like relative to you. So when you learn acupuncture points, actually, like, even though on the diagram it gives you a sense of where it approximately is, that point will be different for every person. And so this body inch just really spoke to me in terms of thinking beyond that universalizing, and how a different scale of measurement might make something different. Which takes me to the other work in progress that's on my mind. And I really, you know, again, this is an invitation to dialogue, to hear what resonates, what you think could be changed, is this notion of universal care. So I've been researching for some written pieces the intersection of care and care technologies, and how technology actually reshapes our understandings of what care ought to be. And as Joan Tronto writes, care is a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. And of course, in thinking about care, I think related to that is also, you know, death itself, and this act of composting. And as I would learn from, you know, death doulas that I interviewed, that the culture that knows how to die well knows how to live well. And I think by that extension knows how to care well. So in this research, you know, I totally acknowledge, coming from California and the Bay Area especially, there's this idea of mythic health. So this idea of perfect well-being and all the technologies that try to force us to really, you know, create that narrative, right? That there is this idea that, you know, there's a perfect health or state of being. But as I was interviewing people, particularly traditional Chinese medicine doctors in Taiwan, it was fascinating to hear their reflections. So one doctor that I interviewed said, people in the West might think, I'll take some medicine and it should be fine, without paying much attention to environmental or societal factors. However, from the perspective of Chinese medicine, considerations like the environment and life stressors are essential. Because of the definition of health is already a complex matter. To be honest, in Western medicine, what is health? Health is defined as no disease. But what does no disease mean? If today my shoulder is sore or not sore, does that count as a disease? And so I've started to think about this as a kind of framework, and I'd be very curious to hear y'all's thoughts about this, but as kind of a framework of care technologies. So there's the kind of dominant view of care as control, care as created by institutions in the state. And then there's a kind of ungovernable place-based care that's upheld through place-based struggle, that's messy, wild, invisible, non-transactional. and what Alondra Nelson might define as social health. And I think this really becomes epitomized to me through the design of electronic health records. And I'm very curious to hear different people's experiences with these. But these are becoming increasingly common across the US. And it's a way of putting all your medical records in one place. In the US, it's usually large corporate software companies that make these electronic health records. It's this idea, I really think, that's trying to cultivate a sense of, individualized health management, rather than extending outwards and thinking about the social and environmental factors. As I started to research more into the origins of this, a lot of this actually came from the 1960s US war on poverty. And it became actually as a way of surveillance and also dreams of cybernetic control. So a lot of the offices of the Office of Economic Opportunity, as they were fighting the war in Vietnam, they started to deploy computation and thinking about how to win the hearts and minds of counterinsurgents in Vietnam. And so they wanted to collect data about, what are the health systems and protocols that we can do to win, to sort of counter these people who are rebelling. And they took this tactic that was happening in Vietnam and essentially transposed it onto the US in a domestic context. So really making this as part of government-sponsored neighborhood health centers in the war on poverty. And in the 1960s, there was this real crystallization of these two kinds of dominant versus ungovernable care, with actually the Black Panthers and the Young Lords in Chicago, who opened up their own community health clinics. So you actually see a map over here of the community health clinics that they opened up, and they formed the People's Health Coalition. This kind of ungovernable care was definitely not embraced by the state, and the state and these organizations were always at odds. And ultimately, the People's Health Coalition, their clinics were actually shut down by the city of Chicago. And the way that they were shut down, to me, reading this through history is fascinating, because it was a newly enacted law that demanded access to the data, to the records of the People's Health Coalition. So that these narratives around data sovereignty, around surveillance, around what we think about as group privacy are not new, but actually there's, precedents of this in history. And so really, these electronic health records as not only a form of self-management and self-control, but also the ways that the electronic health record connects people across geographies. So I've been spending a lot of time at health information technology conferences, which are kind of terrifying places, because it's all like defense contractors who are providing health technology solutions. And actually what was interesting was that the country of the Philippines had a booth at one of these health technology conferences. And they were arguing that a lot of this data work that is needed to maintain an electronic health record, they have a workforce they're uniquely suited to accommodate. I think this also reflects the longer history of the Philippines as a site of colonialism and US imperialism, and this kind of legacy of Filipino nurses going to the US to provide care. It was interesting to see like the official narratives at the Philippines booth being like, yeah, we have like a long history of expertise like dealing with US healthcare, so of course we can accommodate your like modern health technology needs. In Taiwan, what became really interesting to me was the other side of digital health, right? So we have this one side of digital health that's about self-management, and the other side of digital health in literally creating the digital. It was unavoidable to be in Taiwan and to not think about TSMC because they produce 60% of the world's semiconductors, 90% of the world's advanced chips. And I think more and more folks are starting to talk about the water issues involved in semiconductors, but there's also increasingly an issue with actually PFAS chemicals, so forever chemicals that the semiconductor industry uses. They do a lot of lobbying to not ban them. They cause, a lot of metabolic cancers, so everything from, thyroid cancer to certain kinds of leukemia. And this has already been well documented actually in Korea. So there's already the SHARPS organization that's trying to organize around chemical exposure in the semiconductor industry. But I think it really, this kind of the two ends of the digital health spectrum to me presents a kind of puzzle, and particularly around like how life comes to matter and how life, in the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, how life is made precious, or in some cases not precious. In my most recent round of research, I went to the National Museum in Taiwan, and there was actually this statue of a Buddha, a depiction which typically isn't common, but the Buddha as skin and bones. And to circle back around to this idea of future, to this idea of present, and also this kind of living well and dying well, I wanted to end on this image because I think in looking at care and mythic health, it's really reminded me of this kind of core sensation of this image, which is I am of the nature to grow old. There's no way of escaping growing old. And I am of the nature to die. I am of the nature to become ill. And there's no way to escape these things. And so I think in this entanglement, I'm really trying to try to really think through these things conceptually, trying to maybe order them a little bit. And I'd be curious for your thoughts, any suggestions. Yeah. Thank you so much.
So we have microphone here. If there are thoughts, comments, or questions for Xiaowei as well, you can take some time to think about them. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, good night, good evening. I'm Gustavo. I'm part of the Master's Center for Responsible AI. It's amazing that you bring for us that instead of speculating only towards future, we should look to the past. And you brought the archives as this place that we can speculate about how other models of being, other models of living can be also found, like libraries, archives, not only like the corporations. And you've been sharing with us also about other models, so it would be amazing if you could more of this context of these other alternative models. Interested, towards where your gaze looking.
Thanks, Gustavo. So one of the things as part of stewarding Collective Action School is we have a lot of people who join the school anonymously because they're trying to unionize at work and really seeing unionizing as a way to influence what decisions their tech company makes around who they decide to work with, the products that they're trying to build. Something that's not known is that unionizing, you can actually build into your union contracts like what you will and won't work on. So that's kind of this bucket of really reforming the system that we live under, right? And trying to like make life possible in those contexts. But I think there's also other models, especially in the responsible AI model that we've been talking about this week, our cohort, is to really think about solidarity economy models. So, we were talking about earlier today, like, there's one work of dismantling the system, and then there's this other work of building this refuge for us to go to. And maybe it's tech cooperatives, not just ethical tech or ethical tech products, but really thinking about how at the local scale we can start to build, whether it's AI that's used for indigenous language revitalization, and really sustain that through a community-based way, rather than having it be built through a corporate way. And so at Collective Action School, we actually have a community technologist program that tries to incubate and encourage people who are really thinking about these cooperative ways of building technology that's locally situated, and try to sustain them, and thinking about like financial models of doing that. And I think that also really changes the power dynamics as well.
More questions or thoughts for Xiaowei or for the world? Okay, well, you think about it. I have one. Xiaowei, can you tell us a bit more about your very eclectic background, from code into writing into what you shared today? Just to give a bit of the context where these perspectives are coming from.
Yeah, so I actually used to work in tech at a startup, a rocket ship startup, for a while, as a software engineer. After that, I became really kind of depressed and despondent about what, seeing after our company got this big infusion of money from SoftBank's Vision Fund, the new ways that we were being asked to scale and grow the company, I became really disillusioned. But I also really love to code, to program. And so I decided I wanted to leave industry, and actually go back to academia and read a lot of social theory. So I feel like that's, sort of my pathway through it. And I really got actually into coding through design. I went through design school, and I was really curious about actually like the tools that we were using for design, and how they actually constrained or made possible certain design decisions. At the time that I went through design school, like parametric design was really big and so entrusting like the design of a landscape or a building to these very like abstract forces, especially these tools that we had no insight into how they were built. That was something that was really concerning to me. So I was like, okay, I have to learn how to code to understand how these tools shape the designs that we make.
Thank you. Questions? I can continue asking questions while you think of. Okay. This should work.
Hello, I'm Miranda. I'm also on this master's. Let's see if this comes out as a whole sentence. Thank you for this talk. So we're currently in a pandemic, and obviously at its peak, there was lots of different kinds of more ungovernable kinds of community-centered care, which seemed to come to the fore with different people getting involved more with looking after their communities. How do you see your work on kind of digital health and power structures relating to the pandemic? And yeah, do you see any kind of historical precedents that shed light on the various power structures that we saw come to the fore during COVID?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think thinking about it through history, there's always been this kind of interplay, right? And I really see that kind of moment of the People's Health Coalition and, you know, the Black Panthers and Young Lords organizing and building their own community health clinics as really resonating with the ungovernable care that we saw during the pandemic, whether it was mutual aid or trying to create these networks of care. And then you have like governments trying to so-called manage the crisis, but it was really this kind of, at least in the 1960s in Chicago, this crisis, they were calling it a crisis of the urban, but it was ultimately an economic seeming crisis, right? Like we have all these young people, there's like these radical politics, no one wants to work. What are we going to do about this? And I think there was that leveraging of collecting data, saying that it's for, you know, like the good of something, and using that as kind of an excuse to shut down these grassroots form of care. You could arguably say like the government at the time could have just directly given money to the Black Panthers and the Young Lords to continue running these community health clinics and centers, but they didn't, right? They decided to close them down instead under this kind of newly enacted law, and then actually open up less efficient, less community-based clinics that didn't actually function as well. So that is what happened, and a lot of those neighborhood health clinics that were opened up by the city of Chicago, they don't last until this day because they were poorly managed and essentially just like created to kind of combat the radical politics of the time. I think there's so many lessons there for us today, and I'm, you know, definitely not like a conspiracy theorist, anti-government person. I like deeply believe that, you know, public schools are underfunded. We need to be like doing more about that. And also at the same time, I think there is a sense of like resilience and community resilience that we can be further building.
Thank you, Miranda. Any more questions in the room?
So I'm Alina, I'm not in this master's, but anyways, thanks for your talk. And you mentioned your interest in design tools, and what I would like to know is how AI shapes your work, like how you work with AI or without it, and how it influences your process or also the artifacts you produce.
Thank you for that. For me, in an archive of witch fever, I decided to use so if you want to like, you know, sort of run your own trained model and build a neural network, these days if you go onto like Google Colab, or there's any number of really great services where you can actually like be sort of closer to the machine, so to speak. For me, I don't really use anything like Midjourney or any of these more like shiny packaged AI design tools. I think ultimately when we think about especially generative AI and as a tool, I have a lot of questions about you know, where this data is coming from, how the things that I make will be used to train this model. And I think because of those unanswered questions, I feel like for myself personally, I don't like using those tools. I'm not opposed to, you know, creating neural networks or kind of these more like, I want to say like the more simplistic old school AI, even though it's still pretty recent. I think also that term artificial intelligence, AI, when we look deeper into something like ChatGPT, it ultimately is an algorithm that's predicting the next word. And it's really good at predicting the next word in a sentence based off of terabytes and terabytes of data that it's scraped from the internet. And I think having that awareness, for me, it's like less about this question of intelligence and more just like, you know, it's not, I don't know, like it doesn't open up like a lot of creative capacities for me. I will say I use ChatGPT to write a lot of professional emails because that's what it's created for, right? It's created for like this kind of managerial professional class, like, yes, the logistics of this thing will be at this time, like I will be at this place, you know, or like kind of that managerial speak. And in that sense, it's helpful. And I have no problems. It's kind of like stealing from Kinko's or like the local photocopy shop, right? Like you're just using corporate power to fight corporate power.
Thank you. Oh yes, we have a question from the live stream, I guess.
There's a question from people that are in the streaming. This is from Gemma Jones. She says, you talk about technocratic computational ways of thinking about the climate crisis. Sorry. Are there examples of alternative queer technologies confronting climate crisis you are inspired by?
Yes. I think that, you know, the queer computing, it's about the things that fail or the things that are kind of counter to productivity. You know, to me, there's this actually form called like queer gaming, and it's about creating this sense of constantly like failing and not winning and being unproductive at something. I think there's also uses of, you know, certain tools that exist out there to use them in kind of like a counterintuitive way to not generate corporate wealth, but maybe to actually, you know, maybe it's like you hate your job and you're just trying to make your job easier. I also think too that queer computing cannot be disentangled from its political history and its political valence, right? Particularly to some of the things that our cohort in responsible AI were talking about earlier around organizing, around the solidarity economy, around, you know, thinking about technology differently. There's this amazing organizer called, her name's Danielle Blunt, head of Hacking Hustling, and she always says that community is the most powerful form of technology. And I think that's very much embedded in this paradigm of queer computing, is to think about like, how do we create spaces for, how do we create like the dance club, right? Where we can all go to and like be joyful and like let our freak flags fly. That's the alternative and outside of these corporate structures.
Any more questions in the room? I have a Jorge, yeah?
Hello, Jorge. I'm from the Masters for Design for Emergent Features. So yeah, my question is sort of related to those features. I like to ask this question to people that I meet in different fields. So there are archetypes to how future scenarios can be, right? So what's your vision of a positive future scenario, a preferable scenario where your expertise gets us to a better scenario for humanity or for people?
I think I don't really have an expertise or feel like I'm an expert. And I think maybe the biggest expertise, quote unquote, is listening. And I feel like it all, you know, kind of points to when I mentioned Grace Lee Boggs in the future, like the future is always being made, right? And it happens in the present. And I do think that it is this form of community building work and listening and being deeply entangled with each other. And, you know, also as a reminder too, like there is no perfect future or utopia. It literally is no place. And maybe it's really like these heterotopias that we want, like of all different potentials.
Building on that, can you expand a little bit on the concept of heterotopia
Yeah. So for me, when I think of heterotopia, I really think about it as like the underlying conditions that allow different possibilities to thrive. And so what that means for me concretely, right, is like what's on my mind, especially like now and given the state of the US, like that, you know, this shift towards right-wing politics, it is someone's utopia. That is their utopia, right? But that utopia is one that doesn't allow different ways, possibilities of existing to exist. And I think heterotopia is so much harder because it's like, what are those underlying conditions? I think some of those underlying conditions are, to me, pretty apparent, right? It's like some basic things around health, thriving, happiness, everyone having all the things that they need to exist in the world. But it also involves really a different kind of model of decision making, right? That's more place-based, that may be local, translocal. And it acknowledges that everyone's coming to the table with a different standpoint, that there really is no universal. Like, I'm trying to like throw out that metric ruler and really think about the body inch, right? And yeah, I think the heterotopia is where it's like, okay, we all have different body inches, we all have different forms of measurement, but the underlying conditions are there to exist.
plurality and the pluriverse.
Exactly, the pluriverse.
The futures. So any other question? Before we run out of time, I actually want to ask you to expand a bit on a critical, since this is critical futures talks in a critical topic that we have been already studying in the master, which is the very important relationship of water and digital technologies at large. Then, of course, in particular to AI systems. And you briefly mentioned a bit of the research that you have been doing actually in Taiwan, which is a critical territory for this intersection. So if you can expand a bit of why is it, and especially because we are also dealing with a water scarcity in the region where we currently are in this territory. What is the relationship between water and AI?
Yeah, basically using like the amount of water that semiconductor manufacturing uses is just wild. And a lot of that water has to be, because semiconductor manufacturing, it's interesting because there's this weird intersection between like purity and semiconductor manufacturing. So you can't have any dust. The water that you use is like ultra pure water. And it's used in the photolithography process. So like essentially if you have like a chip, right, you've probably all seen like the lines and the different transistors and the connectors. So in order for that to be very precise, all the raw materials you're kind of using have to be very pure. And so in Taiwan, it's a very it's an island. And so the water that it gets comes from rainfall or either the groundwater. And on an island, there's something essentially called saltwater intrusion, where the more groundwater you use, the more salt water actually enters into the groundwater, basically rendering the drinking water less and less basically impossible to drink. And so as climate change is happening, there's fewer typhoons in Taiwan, which usually gets a lot of water, but now it's really experiencing drought. And on top of that, we have the issue with PFAS, so forever chemicals in the water, which essentially is giving residence near a lot of these semiconductor industries, different forms of metabolic cancer. And so I think that's also like one of the, it's like a form of slow violence, right? There's kind of like these moments of sharp crisis and sharp violence, but I think this is an example of what some people, Rob Nixon, calls slow violence. So this ongoing thing, it can become invisible because, you know, something like leukemia or cancer or drought, it happens over such a longer span of time. But it, for me, really made me want to think about different ways of computing, where it's not just about, you know, new electronics, but also the right to repair or perma-computing or using old iPhones to be like your own data server in the community. So I think there's also these technical interventions too.
Thanks, Xiaowei. I think yeah, these entanglements are critical again to the like the deep understanding that needs to happen when we think about relating in responsible ways with digital technologies in different contexts. And we are finding water as one of these critical elements, especially in terms of the literacy that needs to happen. And we are tracking several movements, even in Europe, in the Netherlands, for example, that are resisting against the idea of data centers being built in different rural areas, because data centers, of course, consume not only water but also lots of land, of energy, of electricity, and this is not only, let's say, affecting communities and making a critical situation even more critical, but if you look into just the financials of the resources that these huge computational systems need, it's just too expensive, and not only too expensive to run, but it's just also there is no enough like resources to keep them cool, or to produce manufacture the semiconductors which are at the core of all of these systems. So there's several evidence of the limits of this AI hype that might point to the next big bubble, right? As the bubble that was built around the web already decades ago. So we will be, I think, continuing this exploration and sharing it through this series of talks and a podcast as well. We're very interested in as well hearing from all of you who are not doing the master but are interested in these topics, to hear back what are the pressing questions, and especially the conversations that are happening in other companies, in other contexts, where the use of AI tools is being taken as let's say without questions or without a responsible framework around it, and yeah, to open conversations around how we can learn essentially from the mistakes that the society has made in the past, in the way that we decided to relate it with this idea of technology, without questioning this idea of moving fast and breaking things, and innovation at any cost, and disrupting everything. And that's I think I will leave it there. Thanks for being here. We invite you to join the next Critical Futures talk, which is on February 27 with Nadia Piet from the AI by Design community, who's coming from Amsterdam. And let's give a warm applause. Thank you, Xiaowei.
Thank you. Thanks all.
So good night. Thank you for those in the
Good
live
night.
stream
Thanks
as
all.
well.